Greetings, my name is Dr. Dan Oakley. I'm going to be teaching this class today on health and nutrition. We're going to discuss a couple different topics during this lecture. The first one's going to be a little bit more focused on the biochemistry and the composition of the body. And then we're going to go into actually more detail on the actual cell structure, the composition of those cells, and the actual functions of those cells. The goal here is that when we're done today and we proceed perhaps to the next lesson, and we slowly start to bring nutrition into the scene, we're going to be able to take a look at the whole body and all of its complexity and get a wonderful and great picture of how that nutrition affects the body. Alright, so let's go ahead and get started. Like I just talked about, the first thing we're going to talk about is the biochemical composition of the body. You should see that with the body there's four major components that are going to make up about 96% of the body. Those four components are oxygen, carbon, hydrogen, and of course nitrogen. Now oxygen is the greatest component in our body. That makes up about 65% of our body. That's followed by carbon, which is 18%, and then hydrogen comes in at about 10%, and we finish it up with nitrogen coming in at a scant 3%. Again, that's a total of 96% of the human body weight is produced by these four elements. Now, they're made up of water, protein, carbohydrates, and fats. That's really how these four parts contribute to the body. Now, there's 4% remaining. So if we start out with 100, we take 96 away, and we've got 4%. Now, those remaining 4% are made up by a group of nutrients called macronutrients. Those macronutrients are all minerals. And those minerals are calcium, chloride, magnesium, phosphorus, potassium, sulfur, and sodium. These micronutrients are absolutely essential for maintaining good health. Now, interesting enough, these elements come in surprisingly small quantities. We're going to take a look at a few examples right now on just how minute these quantities are. Iron comes in at 0.004%, copper an amazingly low 0.00015%, and of course iodine is 0.00004%, and we have some stuff like fluorine and silicone that actually come in trace amounts, so barely detectable. Now, when we talk about components of the body, it's important to distinguish there's two different categories. The first one are organic, and the second one are inorganic. Let's briefly talk about the difference between these two components. An organic compound is something that either was produced by something that is now living or was living when it was produced. An inorganic compound, then, is something that was produced by something that wasn't necessarily ever alive and doesn't intend to be alive. Some examples of these, just to clarify: minerals and water components, they're considered inorganic compounds. But things like fat, protein, and carbohydrates, they're considered organic. These materials are absolutely essential in constructing the human body. Now, our bodies are essentially huge factories. What they do is process, convert, and expel compounds. Now, what that means simply is that we're always making something, and whether that stuff is used right away or saved for later use. We also sometimes will make stuff in one part of the body that we don't even use much in that part of the body, and then send it out to other cells in the body to be used. And then, of course, when we're done making stuff and using stuff, we do get some waste products, and we have to eliminate those. An example of this factory and this conversion process: things like food and water can be taken into the body, and then we've taken it through some metabolic reactions. We're going to convert that into tissues and fluids, and again we have a waste product left over. And then, of course, we remove those wastes to things like feces and urine. Now, before we proceed too far, I want to go over a couple different definitions. You're going to see those definitions are anatomy and physiology. So first, let's start with anatomy. What anatomy is basically the study of the structure and the shape of the body and its parts. Anatomy really has to do with the location of the part. So for example, the heart, the anatomy is more that it's in the center of the chest. Okay? There's a couple different subcategories to anatomy, and the first one is gross anatomy. Now, all gross anatomy simply is parts of the body that you can see just by looking with your naked eye. The second part of it, though, is microscopic. Microscopic parts are things that you have to have a microscope in order to be able to see. You can look all day with your eyes, and you're never going to see them. Some examples are things like parts of the cell. Now, when we get into microscopic categories, we should also think a little bit about some other subcategories, such as cytology and histology. Cytology is simply the study of cells, and histology is the study of tissue. Now, shortly we'll actually get into basically the difference between cells and tissues. But for now, just know that these are two different subcategories of the microscopic world. Sometimes you'll hear these definitions used if someone goes to the hospital and has an operation, even a very minor operation, things like when you have warts or moles removed. Oftentimes your doctor will have the actual part of the wart or mole sent to histology and cytology so that the lab techs can look at it and verify that it's what we call benign. That means that it's non-cancerous. Now, the second term is physiology. What physiology really is the study of that body part and how it functions. So the earlier illustration where I talked about with anatomy, the heartbeat in the center of the chest, we would now in physiology explain how that heart in the center of the chest works and circulates the blood to the rest of the body. The reality is that you can't ever really just talk about one or the other. You can't just talk about anatomy or physiology. They kind of go hand in hand. Now, when we get to the body, we should realize there are certain levels of structural organization. So there's kind of a system of how we build stuff in the body. The first thing is atoms. Atoms are the building blocks of matter. And the second unit we're going to talk about is something called molecules. Now, molecules are if we take a bunch of those atoms and join them together. So, for example, if an atom were a brick, and we were to take a bunch of those bricks and build a wall, we now would have made a molecule. The wall would be the molecule. Now, atoms and molecules are not necessarily living in nature, so let's keep that distinguishment clear. Now, cells, then, are the basic unit of living matter. So they are life, the smallest unit of life. Now, tissues are basically when we take a bunch of these cells that are similar in nature and we actually group them together. So, for example, if we had a bunch of heart cells and we put a huge amount of them together, then we would have heart tissue. Again, some other examples, as you can see here, things like epithelial, nervous cell, muscle cells. They all make things like epithelial tissue, connective tissue, muscle tissue, nervous tissue when we group them together. Now, we move up a little bit in the hierarchy, and from tissues we go to organs. So what an organ basically is when we take a bunch of tissue and we piece that together. Kind of like a seamstress might take a bunch of pieces of material and sew them together to make a blanket or a coat or something like that. And then finally we have an organ system, and in that organ system we take a bunch of different organs that work together as a whole, and we call that an organ system. And then when we piece all the organ systems together, we end up with an organism. And that's basically a finished product. So we are organisms. So we are composed of tissue groups, of cells, and of course of organs and organ systems. Now this chart here is just another way I wanted to show you what we just talked about. So we take atoms and molecules, as you can see here, we bind them together with a chemical in the top left-hand corner, and we call that a macromolecule. Now what a macromolecule is kind of like that substance combined with living material. So that's going to be something like DNA, which is the blueprint of how we make cells and body parts. Now when we get enough of that together, we form things called organelles, for example. An organelle simply means a small organ. So that's inside a cell, the pieces of the cell, and we're going to examine that closely shortly. When we get enough of those parts together making things, we make cells, as you can see in this part of the tissue, this picture. And then, like we previously discussed, we throw enough cells together, we get tissue, and then we end up with organs. In this case, that's a picture of the stomach. We move on over to organ system, and that would be the stomach, the liver, and the small and large intestine. And then when we throw all that together, we're going to end up with an organism. Now we're just going to do a brief review of some of the most important parts of our body. We're going to call those body systems. The first part is called the integumentary system. Basically, you think of that as the skin. The purpose of the integumentary system is to protect the inside organs, really. It's like a shield. It also helps with giving some structure to the body, and it helps a lot in making sure that we don't lose too many fluids. It kind of keeps things in. And it does play a key role also in temperature regulation. Now we get to the skeletal system. The purpose of the skeleton really is to support the tissues, right? It gives us some framework. It allows there to be something for the muscles to attach to. And believe it or not, the skeletal system is where we produce our blood cells. Inside the long bones, we have bone marrow, and through a process called diapedesis, we actually produce the blood cells, and then we excrete it outside of the bone into the circulatory system. Now the muscular system, basically, its job is to move your body, right? And basically, another thing it does is it helps in the production of body heat. Every time you move your arm, your legs, a muscle, it produces a certain amount of heat. And that all the pieces of heat combined together help make out what we know as our temperature, our core body temperature. And then we have the nervous system. What that does primarily is control of things such as your muscles. Without the nerves and the muscles working together, we wouldn't be able to coordinate activities, things like picking up a pen off the desk, or riding a bicycle, or even a nice leisurely stroll. Additionally, our nerves do give us the capability to have higher functions, things like thought and reasoning. And then the endocrine system, that helps regulate body metabolism. Okay. We go with the cardiovascular system. Its job mainly is to be that taxi cab or that transportation system to make sure that the cells get things like nutrients and oxygen. And it also takes away the waste and helps get rid of them. The immune system simply helps us to keep healthy. It helps protect us against infection, and it keeps outside invaders, to a minimum, limits the numbers, and hopefully destroys the ones that aren't supposed to be there, so we don't get sick. Now the respiratory system, its primary purpose is for the intake and outtake of air. So we breathe air in, and then we breathe out, and that expels our waste, something called carbon dioxide. Our digestive system simply takes food, breaks it into really small parts, allows it to be transported to the cells where it can be made into energy. And our urinary system helps filter waste from water, keeps the water that is unused within the body, and excretes the garbage. It also helps maintain the right electrolyte balance. If we have too much sodium or sugar sometimes, we'll actually throw that out into the urine to get rid of it from the body so it doesn't harm us. And of course, our reproductive system contains of cells called gametes. And really, the whole purpose of the reproductive system is just to make it so that we can continue on the human species. This chart here lists all the systems in the body. Now, we're not going to go over all these today in great detail, but I just wanted you to get a picture of just how wonderful and amazing the human body is, and how all these systems have to work together to keep us alive and at optimum performance and optimum health, and how so many of these are affected by our diet. Alright, now the second part that we're going to talk about today is we're going to talk about the individual cell level. So again, just a really brief recap of cellular organization. We start out at the cell. We move into tissue, so that's that group of cells working together. We're going to tie those together and make an organ. We're going to proceed then to an organ system. And then finally an organism. Now this picture here is just a generic cell. It's a pretty good illustration of many of the different parts of a cell, and that's why I like this illustration. So as we proceed on and start to talk about different functions and different parts, you can kind of refer back to this and just kind of get a visualization of the parts we're talking about. It makes it a little less abstract. So just to talk for a second about the history of the cell. Again, it's a basic unit of an organism. Cells have always been around, but we didn't know about cells until we had the microscope. This gentleman pictured here discovered cells in the 1600s. His name was Anton von Leeuwenhoek, and he described cells in a journal he kept. He had a microscope, and he just kind of started looking at things, everything he could find, kind of like a kid with a new bike. And he stumbled upon plants And he said, huh, this is interesting. There's different parts to the plant. And that's how he first discovered something. Now, once we have discovered something new, scientists like to talk about things and hash things out and experiment with things. And the byproduct of all those conversations where we developed something called the cell theory. Now, the cell theory is only 3 parts long, so it's not anything horrible to have to deal with or memorize. And the first part of it is that all organisms are